The morning of December 7th, 1941, broke clear and calm over the island of Oahu. At 7:51, Second Lieutenant Philip Rasmussen stood in the latrine of his barracks at Wheeler Field, brushing his teeth in purple-striped pajamas. Through the window he watched what appeared to be a small aircraft diving toward the flight line. Then something dropped from the plane. A bomb. The explosion sent flames and black smoke billowing into the tropical sky. Rasmussen was 23 years old. He had graduated from aviation training at Brooksfield less than 8 months earlier. He was assigned to the 46th Pursuit Squadron, flying obsolete Curtiss P-36 Hawks. This was supposed to be a quiet Sunday morning in paradise. Instead, the Empire of Japan had just declared war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Rasmussen ran to his room. He grabbed his belt, his .45 caliber pistol, and his shoes. He didn't stop to change out of his pajamas. Outside, Japanese aircraft were strafing the area. Machine gun fire kicked up dirt and concrete. Explosions rippled across Wheeler Field. American aircraft sat wingtip to wingtip on the flight line, an anti-sabotage measure that had now become a death trap. Each plane that exploded ignited the one beside it. The entire squadron was being destroyed in a chain reaction of fire. Wheeler Field was the main United States Army Air Corps fighter base on Oahu. It housed the 14th and 15th Pursuit Groups. On the morning of December 7th, 79 aircraft sat parked at Wheeler. The Japanese knew this. Wheeler was their primary target because destroying these fighters meant the American military could mount no aerial defense of the island. At exactly 7:55, 18 Aichi dive bombers from the Japanese carriers Soryu and Kaga had swept in from the north. They came in low and fast. Their orders were simple: destroy every American aircraft on the ground before the pilots could reach them. The Japanese pilots were methodical. They bombed one end of the flight line first, then worked their way down, ensuring maximum destruction. Flames consumed aircraft after aircraft. Ammunition began cooking off inside the burning planes. 50 caliber rounds exploded with sharp cracks. Larger ordnance detonated with concussive booms that shook the ground. Rasmussen sprinted toward the flight line. He saw men running in every direction. Some were trying to reach aircraft. Others were dragging wounded comrades away from the fires. The smell of aviation fuel and burning rubber filled the air. Black smoke obscured the sky. Through the chaos, Rasmussen spotted several Curtiss P-36 Hawks further down the line, away from the main conflagration. These planes had been positioned near the hangar line. They were still intact. The Curtiss P-36 Hawk was already obsolete by 1941 standards. It was a single-seat fighter with a Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp radial engine producing 1,050 horsepower. Maximum speed was 313 miles per hour at 10,000 feet. The armament was minimal: one .50 caliber machine gun and one .30 caliber machine gun mounted in the nose. Against the Japanese Mitsubishi Zero fighter, with its exceptional maneuverability and 4 weapons, the P-36 was outclassed in every category except one. It was available. Rasmussen reached one of the surviving P-36s and climbed into the cockpit. He was still wearing his purple pajamas. He had no helmet, just his aviation headset. An armorer appeared carrying belts of 30 caliber and 50 caliber ammunition over his shoulder. The man jumped onto the wing and began loading the guns. There was no time for a proper pre-flight check, no time to warm the engine. Rasmussen hit the starter. The radial engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. Blue smoke poured from the exhaust stacks. 3 other pilots had reached P-36s at the same time: Second Lieutenant John Thacker, Second Lieutenant Gordon Sterling, First Lieutenant Lewis Sanders. They started their engines and began taxiing toward the runway. Japanese aircraft screamed overhead, strafing anything that moved. Bullets sparked off concrete and metal. Rasmussen advanced the throttle and followed the other fighters. His hands moved through the checklist from memory: mixture rich, propeller pitch, full forward, flaps up. He didn't have time to think about what he was doing. His actions preceded his thoughts. It was pure reaction to the situation. At 8:32, 4 P-36 Hawks took off from Wheeler Field. They were among the first American fighters to get airborne during the Pearl Harbor attack. Rasmussen was flying P-36, a serial number 38014. The plane was painted in standard Army Air Corps olive drab and neutral gray. The number 20 was painted in white on the fuselage. Rasmussen retracted his landing gear and climbed toward the north. Wheeler Field Control Tower radioed orders, fly, to Kaneohe Bay on the northeast side of the island. Japanese aircraft were attacking the naval air station there. The American fighters needed to intercept them before they could escape back to their carriers. Rasmussen acknowledged the transmission and turned northeast. Below him, Pearl Harbor was a vision from hell. Battleship Row was obscured by towering columns of black smoke. Flames poured from the superstructures of multiple ships. The USS Arizona had exploded. The USS Oklahoma had capsized. The USS West Virginia was settling into the mud. Over 2,000 American sailors were dead or dying in the water. Rasmussen climbed through scattered clouds at 5,000 feet. The other 3 P-36s formed up around him. Second Lieutenant Thacker's guns were jammed. Both his .30 caliber and his .50 caliber weapons had malfunctioned during the loading process. He was flying an armed aircraft with no ability to fire. He stayed with the formation anyway, hoping his presence might distract enemy pilots. Second Lieutenant Sterling's aircraft was functioning normally, but Sterling himself would not survive the day. His P-36 would be set ablaze by a Zero, forcing him to bail out. He would die in his parachute, shot by Japanese pilots as he descended. This was the morning when America learned that the rules of warfare had changed. Rasmussen's formation reached Kaneohe Bay at 8:50. Below them, the naval air station was burning. 36 PBY Catalina flying boats had been stationed there. 27 were destroyed. 6 more were damaged. Hangar 102 had taken a direct hit and exploded. The second wave of Japanese attackers was still overhead. Rasmussen counted 11 enemy aircraft. Most were Mitsubishi Zeros. These were carrier-based fighters from the Japanese First Air Fleet. The Zero had been designed for long-range missions and extreme maneuverability. It could outclimb, outturn, and outrun almost any Allied fighter in the Pacific. The only advantage American pilots had was armor. The P-36 had some pilot protection and self-sealing fuel tanks. The Zero had none. Japanese doctrine prioritized performance over survivability. The 4 American P-36s dove into the formation of Zeros. Rasmussen selected a target and opened fire. His .50 caliber machine gun hammered. Tracers arced across the sky. His .30 caliber gun fired 3 rounds and jammed. The ammunition belt had twisted during loading. Now he was down to 1 working weapon. Rasmussen held the trigger down. His .50 caliber rounds stitched across the Zero's fuselage. The Japanese fighter shuddered. Smoke poured from its engine. The Zero rolled inverted and dove toward the water. Rasmussen didn't see if it crashed. He was already engaging another target. His second burst caught a Zero in the wing root. Pieces of metal tore away. The Japanese pilot pulled up sharply, trailing fuel and glycol. Rasmussen started to follow, but his aircraft shuddered violently. Something had hit him. He glanced at his instruments. Hydraulic pressure was dropping. He looked over his shoulder. 3 Zeros were on his tail. All 3 were firing. 20mm cannon shells and 7.7mm machine gun bullets tore into the P-36. Rasmussen felt impacts. His canopy had exploded. Glass fragments filled the cockpit. Wind screamed through the open frame. He still wasn't wearing a helmet. A piece of shrapnel or glass struck him in the head. He felt warm blood running down his face. His first thought was that the top of his skull had been blown off. He reached up gingerly to check. Everything seemed intact. The P-36 lost control. The aircraft lurched violently to the left. Rasmussen fought the stick. Nothing responded normally. The hydraulic lines had been severed. He had no brakes, no landing gear control. The rudder cables had been cut. His feet moved the rudder pedals, but the rudder itself didn't respond. The tail wheel had been shot off entirely. He was flying a crippled fighter with 3 Zeros behind him and no way to maneuver effectively. Then, one of the Japanese pilots made his decision. Rather than continue firing, he accelerated directly toward Rasmussen's damaged P-36. The Zero came in nose-up, approaching near stalling speed. Rasmussen saw the pilot clearly through the Zero's open canopy. The Japanese aviator was staring directly at him. The distance closed to 100 feet. 50 feet. 20 feet. The Zero pilot was going to ram him. The Japanese pilot was Lieutenant Junior Grade Iyozo Fujita. He was 24 years old. He flew from the carrier Soryu as part of the second wave attack on Pearl Harbor. Just minutes earlier, Fujita had witnessed his flight leader and best friend, First Lieutenant Fusata Ida, die in a suicide attack on Kaneohe Naval Air Station. Ida's Zero had been damaged by 50 caliber machine gun fire from Chief Ordnance John Finn. With his fuel tank hemorrhaging and no chance of returning to the carrier, Ida had made a pact with himself. He had told his fellow pilots before taking off that morning, if his aircraft was badly damaged, he would crash it into a worthy enemy target. Ida had banked his burning Zero toward Hangar 101 at Kaneohe. He dove through smoke and fire, attempting to destroy the building and everyone inside. American ground fire tore into his aircraft. The Zero hit the ground short of the hangar. Cartwheeling across the road, the massive radial engine broke free and tumbled through the air. Fusata Ida died, crushed within the wreckage. He was 28 years old. He became the first Japanese pilot killed over Oahu that morning. He would not be the last. Iyozo Fujita had watched his friend die. Now, Fujita himself was under fire from Rasmussen's 50 caliber machine gun. Fujita had also made a pact. If his aircraft could not return to the carrier Soryu, he would die in battle. He closed on Rasmussen's P-36 with his Zero's nose pitched up, about to stall. This was an intentional ramming attack. The Japanese called it Taran. The goal was to use the aircraft itself as a weapon, destroying both planes in a mid-air collision. If the pilots survived the impact and could bail out, so much the better. If not, death in combat was preferable to capture. Rasmussen saw Fujita's Zero filling his entire field of vision. The enemy fighter was seconds from impact. Rasmussen had no working rudder. His hydraulics were gone. His canopy had been blown off. He was flying on instinct, and whatever control authority remained in his ailerons and elevators. He yanked the stick back and to the right with every ounce of strength he had. The P-36 responded sluggishly. The nose pitched up. The aircraft shuddered on the edge of a stall. Fujita's Zero passed directly beneath Rasmussen's fighter. The two aircraft missed each other by inches. Rasmussen felt his P-36 buck as the Zero's slipstream caught his damaged tail. For a moment, the American fighter hung in the air, nose high, engines screaming, on the verge of falling out of the sky. Then gravity won. The P-36 dropped into an uncontrolled spin. Rasmussen fought the controls. The aircraft tumbled through the clouds. Sky, ocean, mountains spun past his canopy opening. Centrifugal force pinned him against the seat. He couldn't reach the canopy jettison handle. He couldn't reach his seatbelt release. If he didn't regain control, he would ride the aircraft all the way into the mountains. At 5,000 feet, he broke through the cloud deck. Below him was green jungle and jagged volcanic ridges. The P-36 continued spinning. 4,000 feet, 3,000 feet. Rasmussen worked the stick and throttle, trying anything to break the spin. At 2,000 feet, the aircraft finally responded. The spin stopped. Rasmussen leveled the wings. His altimeter showed 1,500 feet. He was over mountainous terrain with no room for error. The P-36 was barely flying. Every control input produced a delayed, unpredictable response. He couldn't see properly. Blood from his head wound had run into his eyes. His face was covered in glass fragments and torn skin. Wind howled through the missing canopy. The noise was deafening. Rasmussen turned west toward Wheeler Field. He couldn't land anywhere else. His hydraulics were gone, which meant no landing gear, no brakes. He would have to belly land on the grass field. If he survived the landing, he could fight again. If he didn't survive, at least he had taken a Zero down with him. He spotted First Lieutenant Sanders's P-36 nearby. Sanders had also engaged the Japanese fighters. His aircraft was shot full of holes but still flying. The two damaged American fighters formed up and headed back to Wheeler together. The flight back was 7 miles. It took less than 5 minutes. To Rasmussen, it felt like hours. Every second, he expected his engine to quit. The Pratt & Whitney radial had taken multiple hits. Oil pressure was dropping. Coolant temperature was climbing. Black smoke trailed from the cowling. The engine coughed and sputtered, but kept running. Rasmussen nursed the throttle, trying to keep the RPM steady. If the engine seized, he would have to bail out or crash land in hostile territory. Wheeler Field appeared ahead through the smoke. The base was still burning. Rasmussen could see wrecked aircraft scattered across the flight line. Fire trucks were spraying foam on burning fuel. Ambulances moved between the hangars. The control tower was still standing. That meant someone was still coordinating operations. Rasmussen transmitted on the radio. He needed clearance to make an emergency landing. The tower responded immediately. All runways were clear. Emergency equipment was standing by. Land on the grass field when ready. Rasmussen circled once to line up his approach. He had no flaps, no landing gear, no brakes, no tail wheel, no rudder control. He would come in haste and hope the wet morning grass provided enough friction to stop the aircraft before it flipped over. He reduced power and started his descent. The P-36 settled toward the ground. Rasmussen kept the nose slightly high, trying to protect the propeller for as long as possible. The fighter's belly touched grass at 80 miles per hour. The impact was violent. Metal scraped across dirt and grass. Sparks flew from the fuselage. The propeller blades struck the ground and bent backward. The engine screamed in protest. Rasmussen cut the ignition and fuel. The aircraft skidded sideways. Without a tail wheel or rudder, he had no directional control. The P-36 spun 360 degrees. Grass and mud flew everywhere. Finally, after 2 complete rotations, the fighter came to rest, pointing back toward the runway. Rasmussen sat in the cockpit, his hands still gripping the stick. He was covered in blood, glass, and hydraulic fluid. His purple pajamas were soaked through. His headset had been torn off during the landing. He could hear men running toward the aircraft. Ground crew members climbed onto the wing to help him out. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. 2 men grabbed his arms and pulled him from the cockpit. They lowered him to the ground and called for a medic. Rasmussen looked back at his P-36. The fuselage was riddled with bullet holes. Some accounts would later claim nearly 500 holes. Every panel had damage. The tail section was held together by a few twisted metal spars. The canopy was gone. The landing gear was still retracted, bent, and useless. Oil and hydraulic fluid dripped from multiple punctures. The aircraft would never fly again. But Rasmussen was alive. And Lieutenant Junior Grade Iyozo Fujita was also alive. Fujita Zero had not been destroyed in the failed ramming attempt. The Japanese pilot pulled out of his attack and headed back toward his carrier. He landed aboard Soryu later that morning. He survived not only Pearl Harbor, but also the Battle of Midway 6 months later. Fujita would continue flying combat missions throughout the Pacific War. He would fight at the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal, and Iwo Jima. He survived the entire war. In later years, he would participate in reconciliation efforts between former enemies. He became a witness to history, describing the events of December 7th to historians and researchers. The ramming attempt over Kaneohe Bay lasted perhaps 5 seconds. In that brief moment, 2 young pilots faced death. One was a 23-year-old American in purple pajamas flying an obsolete fighter with 1 working gun. The other was a 24-year-old Japanese aviator who had just watched his best friend die in a suicide attack. Both pilots made split-second decisions. Fujita chose to ram rather than continue firing. Rasmussen chose to pull up rather than accept the collision. Both survived. The planes did not collide. No explosion occurred. No debris rained from the sky. The title promises a story that didn't quite happen. An American pilot ramming a Japanese bomber, both planes exploding, a miraculous parachute escape. That's the Hollywood version. The reality was somehow more remarkable. A pilot in pajamas, flying a damaged aircraft with no hydraulics and no rudder, managed to avoid a ramming attack by a Zero fighter, regained control from a deadly spin, and landed a crippled aircraft on grass with no landing gear. The real story doesn't need embellishment. The Pearl Harbor attack killed 2,403 Americans. It wounded 1,104 more. 4 American pilots got airborne from Wheeler Field that morning in P-36 Hawks. 1 was killed. 3 survived. Between them, they shot down 2 Japanese aircraft and damaged several others. Second Lieutenant Gordon Sterling died when his parachute was shot, full of holes, by Japanese pilots. Second Lieutenant John Thacker flew his entire sortie with jammed guns, unable to fire a single round. First Lieutenant Lewis Sanders shot down 1-0 and returned with his aircraft heavily damaged. Second Lieutenant Philip Rasmussen shot down 1-0, possibly damaged another, survived a ramming attempt, recovered from an uncontrolled spin, and belly-landed his shot-up P-36 at Wheeler Field. Rasmussen was awarded the Silver Star for his actions on December 7, 1941. The citation read that he displayed extraordinary heroism in action against an enemy of the United States. He continued flying combat missions throughout the Pacific War. He flew a bombing mission over Japan that earned him a Distinguished Flying Cross. He participated in operations across the Pacific, Europe, and the Middle East. He became Chief of Operations at Eglin Air Force Base. He retired from the United States Air Force in 1965 with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. The mythology around Pearl Harbor often focuses on the surprise, the destruction, the overwhelming defeat. But beneath the smoke and flames were individual stories of improvisation and survival. Pilots who ran to their planes in pajamas, sailors who manned machine guns while their ships were sinking, defenders who fought back with whatever weapons they could find. The Japanese achieved tactical surprise. They destroyed much of the Pacific Fleet. They killed thousands, but they failed in their strategic objective. They did not break American will. They did not prevent American retaliation. The ramming attempt over Kaneohe Bay was one tiny fragment of a massive battle. In the chaos of that morning, with hundreds of aircraft in the air and explosions everywhere, this brief encounter between 2 pilots barely registered. Japanese records make no mention of Fujita's ramming attempt. American records focus on Rasmussen's kill and his remarkable landing. The full story only emerged years later through interviews and historical research. But the encounter reveals something important about December 7, 1941. Both sides expected to fight according to established rules. The Japanese expected American forces to be unprepared and unable to mount effective resistance. The Americans expected that any attack would come with warning, allowing time to respond. Both sides were wrong. The Japanese encountered fierce resistance from the few defenders who made it into action. The Americans learned that total war meant enemy pilots would strafe men in parachutes and ram damaged aircraft rather than allow their opponents to escape. Fusata Ieda's suicide attack at Kaneohe was not officially a kamikaze mission. The organized kamikaze units would not be formed until 1944. But Ida's decision to crash his damaged Zero into an enemy target established a precedent. Japanese military culture emphasized death over surrender. Capture was considered the ultimate dishonor. If an aircraft was too damaged to return home, using it as a final weapon was seen as honorable. This mindset would culminate 3 years later in the systematic use of suicide attacks against American naval forces. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Iyozo Fujita's attempted ramming of Philip Rasmussen occurred in the context of this cultural mindset. Fujita had just watched his friend Ida die, attempting exactly this type of attack. Fujita himself had made a pact to die in combat if necessary. When he found himself engaging a damaged American fighter, ramming appeared to be a logical tactical choice. Destroy the enemy fighter while potentially preserving ammunition for other targets. If the Zero was destroyed in the collision, so be it. Death in combat was acceptable. Capture or retreat was not. But Rasmussen's desperate maneuver broke the equation. The collision didn't happen. Both aircraft survived the encounter. Fujita had to make a new choice: continue the attack or return to the carrier. He chose to return. Perhaps his fuel was low, perhaps his ammunition was depleted, perhaps seeing Rasmussen's skill in avoiding the ram convinced Fujita that the American pilot deserved to live. The historical record doesn't explain Fujita's decision. We only know that he disengaged and headed back to Soryu. Rasmussen never knew the Japanese pilot's name. For decades, the identity of the Zero pilot who attempted to ram him remained unknown. Historical research eventually identified Fujita through Japanese military records and post-war interviews. By then, both men were elderly. Fujita had become an anti-war activist in Japan, giving speeches about his combat experiences and warning younger generations about the horrors of warfare. Rasmussen had retired from the Air Force and was living in Florida. There is no record of the two men ever meeting. The Curtiss P-36 Hawk that Rasmussen flew on December 7, 1941, serial number 38014, was too damaged to be repaired. It was stripped for parts and eventually scrapped, but another P-36A, the very first production model delivered to the Army Air Corps, was preserved and is now on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. It has been painted to represent Rasmussen's aircraft from Pearl Harbor, complete with battle damage and the purple pajamas story. A mannequin of Rasmussen in pajamas sits in the cockpit. The exhibit has become one of the most popular displays at the museum. Philip Rasmussen died on April 30th, 2005, from complications related to cancer. He was 86 years old. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, Section 66, Site 1390. His headstone lists his rank, his service dates, and his decorations. It doesn't mention the purple pajamas or the ramming attempt. It doesn't need to. The men who served with him remember. The historians who study Pearl Harbor remember. And now you know the story. The morning of December 7th, 1941 changed everything. America entered World War II. The Pacific War began in earnest. Thousands of young men like Philip Rasmussen and Iyozo Fujita found themselves thrust into combat with minimal preparation and obsolete equipment. Some died. Some survived. All were changed forever. The mythology says an American pilot rammed a Japanese bomber, both planes exploded, and he parachuted to safety. The reality is more complex and somehow more human. Two pilots faced each other in the sky over a burning island. One tried to ram. The other pulled up at the last possible second. Both lived, both remembered, and both carried the weight of that morning for the rest of their lives. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.